So good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay, so let's start. Our today lecture will be dedicated to cranial nerves. So I think most of the groups have already completed CNS, yes, and the peripheral nervous system as well. And the next topic, it is actually cranial nerves, organs of sense in cranial nerves. So today we'll talk about cranial nerves. We'll discuss peculiarities of development and structure and regions of innervation of each of the cranial nerves. So if you remember from the peripheral nervous system, from the spinal nerves, they are metameric. So you remember, yes, that spinal cord consists of segments. That segment of spinal cord, it is a transverse section of it from which 4 roots arise, 2 ventral and 2 dorsal, and each ventral and each dorsal root, they join together and they form trunk of spinal nerve, and then trunk of spinal nerve is divided again into its branches, and actually nearly all the spinal nerves, like they have very similar structure, very similar branches. The only difference is in the presence or absence of autonomic fibers, and you remember that spinal nerves from C8 to L2, they contain autonomic fibers because they have lateral horns in the segments, yes, and above C8 and below L2 there are no lateral horns in the segments of spinal cord, and that's why there are no autonomic fibers which arise through ventral root, but still there are autonomic fibers which join anterior and posterior branches from gray communicating branches, yes. So a structure of each spinal nerve is similar, and each spinal nerve contains both sensory and motor fibers as well as autonomic fibers. So for cranial nerves, it's not like that. They are different. So first of all, they are not metameric. So there is no segmental spreading of branches, although there is a bilateralism. So cranial nerves are paired nerves. Each cranial nerve, it doesn't matter which pair is it, has right and left. And they are bilateral and they are symmetrical. Only in some very exclusive cases, topography of branches is slightly different. But in most cases, it absolutely repeats one another. And the second difference between spinal nerves and cranial nerves, that not all cranial nerves are mixed. Later we will talk about it. Some of them can be purely sensory, so it means they will contain only sensory fibers. Some of them will be purely motor, contain only motor fibers. Some of them will combine in themselves sensory and motor fibers, and such nerves are named mixed nerves. And some of them will also contain autonomic fibers. So when we describe cranial nerve, there is a special plan of description. First of all, when you start, you should tell about its sequence number. They are 12, so from 1st to the 12th, you always should say sequence number. Then name in English and in Latin as always. So for example, first pair of cranial nerves, it is olfactory nerve, and in Latin it is nervus olfactorius. Then you should give functional classification of these nerves, if they are sensory, motor, or mixed. So mixed nerves are those nerves which contain in themselves both sensory and motor fibers, not autonomic, yes? So mixed nerve is that nerve that contains both sensory and motor fibers. Then you should mention presence or absence of autonomic fibers. So it can be a motor nerve with autonomic fibers. It can be, for example, mixed nerve with autonomic fibers. If, for example, nerve is motor and it contains autonomic fibers, this nerve is not mixed. Nerve is mixed only if it contains both sensory and motor fibers. Okay, then you should name nuclei. Actually, that is the part that we have already studied in central nervous system, and here we will just revise it. So about the nuclei, you should tell also the name, the function of nucleus. You remember that all the nuclei are divided into sensory, motor, and autonomic also, yes? Location of this nucleus, where exactly, in which part of brainstem it is located. Then projection onto the rhomboid fossa. So when we were studying central nervous system, I hope you remember, we were telling that not all the nuclei are projected onto the rhomboid fossa. It's obviously because rhomboid fossa is formed by dorsal surfaces of pons and medulla oblongata, and so only those nuclei which are located in the pons and in the medulla oblongata, it means nuclei of the cranial nerves from the 5th to the 12th pairs, only they are projected onto the rhomboid fossa. And nuclei of the rest cranial nerves are certainly not projected onto the rhomboid fossa. Please memorize it. The next, exit of the root from the brain. Actually, we also studied it when we studied central nervous system. I even asked all of you to make a table, yes? Then exit of nerve from the cranial cavity. For this, you will need knowledge of craniology. You will revise it. And the very last thing, it is regions of innervation and branches. So that is this branches. They belong to peripheral nervous system. Actually, roots also belong to peripheral nervous system. So that's what we mainly will study. It is absolutely new information for us because the rest information about nuclei, about exit of roots from the brain and from cranial cavity, we have already discussed it. We will just revise. That is the plan of cranial nerve description. So you know that cranial nerves are 12 pairs, and the sequence number they received due to their location at the inferior aspect of the brain, at the base of the brain. So the most anterior nerve, that is olfactory, it is first pair, and then the most posterior nerve, it is hypoglossal, it is the 12th pair, yes? So here you can see location, approximate location of the roots of cranial nerve. So you see that olfactory nerve, the first pair, lies in the olfactory sulcus, yes, that belongs to the frontal lobe. Then optic nerve joins optic chiasm, oculomotor nerve that is located in the interpeduncular fossa, yes, between two cerebral peduncles. Trochlear nerve, the only nerve that arises from dorsal surface, but then it surrounds cerebral peduncles from lateral side and comes ventrally. Trigeminal nerve, the 5th pair, that arises in the point between lateral margin of pons and middle cerebellar peduncles. Then here we can see 3 more nerves, 6th, 7th, and 8th pairs, which are all located in the pontomedullary junction. Then 9th, 10th, and 11th nerve, which arise from retroolivary sulcus of the medulla oblongata, and hypoglossal nerve that arises from enterolateral sulcus of medulla oblongata. Let me remind you that lecture doesn't mean that you should try to go on air. I already have 2 users who want to go on air. You will not go on air today. You will demonstrate your knowledge to your teachers at the practical classes. Okay. There are different mnemonics to memorize names of these 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So, for example, here you can see in this column, mnemonic then can allow helps us to memorize the names of the nerves, because each new word starts with the same letter from which each next pair of cranial nerves starts. Yes, so here you can see on Old Olympus, towering tops, a thin and German viewed some hops. Yes, you can use it. You can find another method to memorize. Actually, with the time, you will understand that everything is very logic, and you don't need any way to memorize by the first letters, just you understand it. Yes, and the other thing, the other mnemonic can allow us to memorize also functional classification of the nerves, like sensory, motor, or both. Both means mixed, yes. So some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter most. Very deep sentence, I think. Okay, you can choose any way of memorizing. Yes. So yes, what is the functional characteristics of cranial nerves? There are purely sensory, purely motor, there are mixed, which contain both sensory and motor fibers, and there are nerves which contain also autonomic fibers. So purely sensory nerves are first, second, and eighth pairs. So first it is olfactory nerve, which is responsible for smelling. Second is optic, that is responsible for vision. And the eighth pair, it is vestibulocochlear nerve, that is responsible for balance and equilibrium and hearing. Yes. Purely motor nerves, they are third, fourth, and sixth pairs. They are oculomotor, trochlear, and abductor nerve. We have already talked about them when we studied organal vision. And so each of these nerves, all of these nerves, they participate in nerve supply of extrinsic, actually both extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of an eyeball. Also 11th pair, that is accessory nerve, is purely motor, and 12th pair hypoglossal nerve is motor nerve. There are nerves which combine in themselves sensory and motor fibers. It is the 5th pair trigeminal, 7th pair facial, 9th pair glossopharyngeal, and 10th pair it is vagus nerve. There are nerves which contain autonomic fibers. It is also oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerve. What you have to memorize? If cranial nerves contain autonomic fibers, these fibers are always parasympathetic, because we will study it later, autonomic nervous system. And autonomic nervous system, probably you studied it at school, is divided into sympathetic part and parasympathetic part. And so central part, nuclei, sympathetic nuclei, they are located in lateral horns of segments of spinal cord from C8 to L2. And central part of parasympathetic nervous system, it is presented by nuclei in the brainstem, parasympathetic nuclei, and also in the sacral segments of spinal cord. So here in the brainstem, all the autonomic nuclei, they are parasympathetic. So if cranial nerves contain autonomic fibers, these fibers are always parasympathetic. You have to memorize it. So let's start from the very beginning. First pair, it is olfactory nerve, nervus olfactorius, I have already told you. So first olfactory, and second pair, it is optic nerve. First and second pairs of cranial nerves are considered to be false cranial nerves, as they have neither sensory ganglia nor nuclei. Actually, about ganglia, we'll talk about it later, we can argue, it is under the debate, but yes, indeed, there are no nuclei in CNS for olfactory and for the optic nerve. There are just subcortical centers, but optic nerve and olfactory nerve, they end much earlier, much before, like they do not enter actually CNS at all. So these are false cranial nerves. They don't have nuclei, so that's why we shouldn't describe them. Olfactory nerve is an outgrowth of telencephalon. It is forebrain, yes? Here we can see it. We know that olfactory nerve doesn't form a single trunk. It consists of 15 to 20 small fibers, thin fibers, which pass through opening in the cribriform plate of an ethmoid bone. yes, olfactory foramina in the cribriform plate of an ethmoid bone. We studied it in craniology. It is a communication between anterior cranial fossa and nasal cavity. So olfactory nerve can form 15 to 20 olfactory filaments consisting of axons of bipolar olfactory neurosensory cells in the olfactory region of the nasal cavity. So here in the olfactory region of the nasal cavity, bodies of the bipolar cells located, and the axons enter cranial cavity, and they reach olfactory bulb. Olfactory bulb, it is like an expansion, yes, where olfactory nerves they end, and backward from olfactory bulb, olfactory tract starts. So actually part of peripheral nervous system, it's only this, yes, olfactory nerves. And olfactory bulb is formed by bodies of second-order neurons, by mitral cells. And axons of this second-order neurons, they follow backward, they form olfactory tract, they reach anterior perforated substance, if you remember, and they enter CNS. But it is already olfactory tract. It's not olfactory nerve anymore. So, and actually, this olfactory bulb, we can say it is ganglion, yes, because it is formed by bodies of neurons, of sensory neurons. Yes, it is olfactory bulb, it is ganglion. No, and after that, olfactory tract continues backward, lying in the olfactory sulcus. Actually, that is all. After that, olfactory analyzer, conducting tract of olfactory analyzer continues, that we have actually discussed in the topic organs of sense. Yes, we will discuss it again, we'll revise it, but we have already studied it. So the second P of cranial nerves, it is optic nerve, nervus opticus. And also optic nerve, you know, it is included. It is one of the parts of conducting tract of optic analyzer or visual pathway. And when we studied visual pathway, we were saying that it consists of 4 neurons, and 3 of them are located in the retina. And first it is rods and cones, second it is bipolar cells, and third it is ganglionic cells. And so optic nerve is formed by axons of third-order neurons of visual pathway. It is ganglionic cells. And optic nerve enters cranial cavity through the optic canal, and it ends in the optic chiasm. After the optic chiasm, optic tract starts. Optic nerve, it is an outgrowth of diencephalon, and it is formed by axons of ganglionic cells of retina, third-order neurons of visual analyzer pathway. Here we can see rods and cones, yes, which are located in outer, their bodies are located in the outer nuclear layer. Then we can see bipolar cells, whose bodies are located in the inner nuclear layer, and then ganglionic cells, whose bodies are located in the ganglion cell layer. And axons of these ganglionic cells, they enter, they form optic nerve. So optic nerve enters cranial cavity because it is sensory. It enters, yes, through the optic canal. Optic canal, you remember, is located in the base of lesser wings of sphenoid bone. So in the optic nerve, 4 parts are distinguished topographically, yes, according to the topography. They are 4. First, that very small part, it's only 1 millimeter. It is intraocular part that passes inside the eyeball. It is optic nerve head. Then infraorbital part, 25 millimeters, from the posterior pole, from the eyeball, up to the entrance into the optic canal. It's 25 millimeters. Intracanalicular part inside the optic canal, it is about 5 millimeters. And the last one, after the exit from the optic canal up to the optic chiasm, it is intracranial part. It is about 10 millimeters. So that is the topographical parts of the optic nerve. So also when we studied organ of vision, we were saying that not all the fibers of optic nerve decussate in the optic chiasm. Only those fibers which come from the nasal eye field. yes, medially. But onto the nasal eye field, rays fall which come from the temporal side, yes? And that's why optic tracts are formed by ipsilateral part of fibers from the temporal eye field and contralateral part of fibers from the nasal eye field of the opposite eyeball, yes? We have to know it. It's very important. And we use this fact, ophthalmologists and neurologists, neurosurgeons, they use this fact for a topical diagnostics. So to make a diagnosis, to find the place of an injury basing on the symptoms. So injury to any part of the visual pathway results in selected visual field loss, yes? So if there is a lesion in the optic nerve, then it will be ipsi blindness. So person will not see anything by that eye whose optic nerve is damaged, yes? If there is a chiasmatic lesion, then it can result in bitemporal hemianapsia. So this person, like he has a tunnel-like vision. What does it mean? He sees very well what is in front of him because his lateral parts of the retina, they do not suffer, yes? Impulses from lateral part of retina, they successfully reach cortical center. But impulses from the nasal part, from the medial part of retina, they cannot reach cortical center because there is a chiasmatic lesion. And as I have already told you, onto the medial part of the retina, rays from temporal side fall down, yes? So that's what we, such a patient do not see. And such injury, such condition is named bitemporal hemianapsia. Post-chiasmatic lesion means lesion of an optic tract close to lateral geniculate bodies can result in unilateral homonymous hemianapsia. Unilateral homonymous hemianapsia. So it means that we do not see anything like we do not see anything that comes from the medial part of contralateral of the opposite eye and lateral part from the same eye. That is in case of post-chiasmatic lesion. And lesions distally to the geniculate ganglion can result in upper or lower homonymous quadrant anapsia. So if we don't see only one small quadrant. So it's very important in neurology. I think you will need this information when you reach neurology. So the third pair, yes, of the third pair of cranial nerves, it is oculomotor nerve, nervus oculomotorius. So it innervates, it supplies 4 out of 6 extrinsic eye muscles. And we also have discussed it when we studied organ of vision. So they are 6, yes, extrinsic muscles, 4 rectus, superior, inferior, medial, and lateral, and 2 oblique, superior and inferior. And so superior, inferior, and medial rectus muscles, as well as inferior oblique muscle, they are supplied by oculomotor nerve. Levator palpebral muscle also is also supplied by oculomotor nerve. So this is motor nerve with autonomic component, with autonomic fibers. So motor fibers, they supply this these muscles, which we have already mentioned above. And autonomic fibers, they supply intrinsic muscles of an eyeball, such as sphincter papillae muscle and also ciliary muscle. So Purlier nucleus, one of the nucleus, yes, it is a group of cells that is located in the midline of the oculomotor nuclear complex, thought to be associated with ocular convergence, or its other name is impar, nucleus impar, unpaired nucleus or convergational nucleus, it is responsible for simultaneous movement of an eyeballs, and it's like convergational movement in case when we are tuned to the near vision. Yes, wait. Also, there is one more motor. It is like unpaired accessory motor nucleus. Yes, there is also main motor nucleus. It is paired. All the nuclei are located in the midbrain at the level of the superior colliculi. So, because they are in the midbrain, they are definitely not projected onto the rhomboid fossa. Yes, and parasympathetic nucleus. It is Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Or Yakubovich nucleus, it is also named, and as I have already told you, it is responsible for the contraction of intrinsic muscles of an eyeball, which are ciliary muscle and sphincter papillae muscle. So oculomotor nerve arises from the brain, its roots arise from the brain in the oculomotor sulcus that is located at the medial surface of cerebral peduncles. And then this nerve leaves cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure that is located between greater and lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. So two functional components of oculomotor nerve. Somatic portion supplies four ocular extrinsic muscles and levator palpebra superioris to elevate upper eyelid. Yes, that is responsible for eyelid movement. Yes, and so autonomic portion that is controlled by Edinger-Westphal nuclei supplies intrinsic ocular muscles such as constrictor muscles of iris, sphincter papillae muscle, yes, and also ciliary muscle. So the function of this Edinger-Westphal nucleus, it is to control parasympathetic functions such as pupillary constriction in response to the light reflex, and also lens modification for the near vision, accommodation, convergence, reflex. Actually, in details, we discussed it in the topic of organ of vision, yes? Okay, the fourth pair, it is trochlear nerve. Nervus trochlearis is motor nerve, purely motor, and it supplies only one extrinsic eye muscle, that is superior oblique muscle. Its action results in abduction, lateral rotation, and depression of an eyeball. So it makes the eye move outward and downward, laterally, downward, and also inferiorly. Yes, inferiorly it's downward. Yes, sorry, downward and laterally. That's true. Yes. So it is the only cranial nerve that exits in the posterior side of the brainstem. So there is only one nucleus in this nerve, and it is motor nucleus, and it is located also in the brain, in the midbrain, at the level of inferior colliculi, and roots of this nerve arise at the level of superior medullary veil, the base or frenulum of superior medullary veil, yes, and after that it surrounds the nerve itself, like it surrounds cerebral peduncles from lateral side, and then it moves anteriorly also to the superior orbital fissure. It passes through the superior orbital fissure, and it supplies this superior oblique muscle of an eyeball. The sixth pair of cranial nerves, it is abducens nerve, nervus abducens. It is also purely motor nerve, and it also supplies only one muscle, extrinsic muscle of an eyeball, that is lateral rectus muscle. Its action of this muscle is to abduct the eyeball, and that's why it is named abducens nerve, nervus abducens, yes? Here you can see it. So it has only one nucleus, motor nucleus of abducens nerve or abducens nucleus, and it is located in the pons, and it is projected onto the upper triangle of the rhomboid fossa at the region of facial colliculus. You remember, yes, that facial colliculus, it is like an elevation, like a hill-like structure that is formed by fibers of facial nerve. Fibers from motor nucleus of facial nerve, but the nucleus that is projected onto this place, it is abductor nerve, because motor nucleus of facial nerve is projected slightly laterally and inferiorly. So root of abductor nerve leaves the brain in the pontomedullary junction between pons and medulla oblongata. And also it goes in the most medial part of it, yes? And it also goes anteriorly and it enters superior orbital fissure. And after it enters, it supplies lateral rectus muscle for abduction. So fifth pair of cranial nerves, it is a very big nerve. It is trigeminal, nervus trigeminus. Trigeminal because it has 3 branches. That's why it has such a name. So cranial nerve number 5, the fifth pair of cranial nerves, it is responsible for cutaneous, touch, pain and temperature, and proprioceptive sensation. Proprioceptive, just I remind you, yes, it is awareness of posture and relative muscle movement. From the face, head, oral and nasal cavities, sinuses and teeth, anterior 1/3 of the tongue, anterior half of the auricle, external auditory meatus, and external surface of tympanic membrane. Motor part controls muscles of mastication, including lateral and medial pterygoid, masseter temporalis muscle, yes, and speech production, tensor veli palatini muscle from the soft palate, and tensor tympani from the middle ear. So what you have to understand is that the fifth pair of cranial nerves, it controls muscles involved in chewing, so masticatory muscles, but not muscles of facial expression, because muscles of facial expression will be supplied by the facial nerve. So it is mixed nerve, as you have already noticed, yes, so it has sensory part, motor part, so it means it's mixed. It doesn't contain autonomic fibers. And there are 4 nuclei in the trigeminal nerve. 1 is motor, and 3 nuclei are sensory nuclei. So motor nucleus is situated in the pons, and it is projected onto fovea cranialis of rhomboid fossa. And 3 sensory nuclei, they are mesencephalic nucleus that is situated in the midbrain, and it provides proprioceptive sensitivity from masticatory muscles and muscles of an eyeball. There is pontine nucleus and spinal nucleus. I want to draw your attention. These nuclei, they are not responsible for different regions. They supply all of the regions which were mentioned in the previous slide, yes, but they are functionally different. It is described here. So mesencephalic, once again, I'm telling you, provides proprioceptive sensitivity from masticatory muscles and muscles of an eyeball. Pontine nucleus, that corresponds to locus ceruleus of rhomboid fossa. It provides tactile and deep proprioceptive sensitivity, so touch and pressure, yes? And spinal nucleus is long. It occupies medulla oblongata and enters also spinal cord, and it reaches even the 5th cervical segment, and it provides pain and temperature sensitivity. So there is no division due to the branches, due to the regions of nerve supply, but it is functional division. Each nucleus performs different function. Please try to remember that. So here we can see, certainly mesencephalic nucleus is not projected onto the rhomboid fossa because it is located in the midbrain. Then here we can see pontine nucleus that is projected onto the locus ceruleus. If you remember locus ceruleus, it is one of the nuclei that belongs to reticular formation. If you don't remember, please revise it. So spinal nucleus is projected onto the lower triangle of rhomboid fossa. Onto lower triangle of the rhomboid fossa, laterally from sulcus limitans. So, and the motor nucleus of trigeminal nerve, it is located in the pons, and it is projected onto the cranial fovea. It is the uppermost point of sulcus limitans. Yes, I hope that you remember it. Okay, so now about the roots. So the roots of trigeminal nerve, here we can see it, they arise in the boundary between pons and middle cerebellar peduncles, so in the lateral margin of the pons. And after that, roots, like this nerve, it moves anterolaterally and it reaches anterior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone. And if you remember, if you have already begun to prepare for your finals, if you remember here, on the anterior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone, in its anterior part close to the apex, there was a trigeminal impression, impressio nervi trigemini. And this trigeminal impression is for the ganglion of trigeminal nerve. Because trigeminal nerve doesn't contain autonomic fibers, it's clearly that ganglion is sensory, yes? So its name is a semilunar ganglion. Here you can see it, or Gasserian ganglion, or just trigeminal ganglion. So it is located here on the anterior surface of the petrous part of temporal bone. So because it is sensory ganglion, certainly motor fibers do not pass through it. Motor fibers, they pass under it. And so after the ganglion, all the fibers are divided into 3 terminal branches because it is trigeminal, yes? So the first branch, it is ophthalmic nerve. Here we can see it. The second branch, it is maxillary nerve. And the third branch, it is mandibular nerve. Certainly names were given due to the regions of nerve supply. Ophthalmic nerve supplies orbit, structures inside the orbit and after they exit from the orbit. And maxillary nerve supplies region of maxilla, upper jaw, yes, and mandibular nerve supplies mandibular region. Here you can see it. Yes, ophthalmic nerve leaves cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure together with 3rd, 4th, and 6th pairs of cranial nerves, and maxillary nerve leaves cranial cavity through foramen rotundum. And you remember that foramen rotundum, it is a communication between middle cranial fossa and pterygopalatine fossa. And mandibular nerve leaves cranial cavity through the foramen ovale between middle cranial fossa and external cranial base. So yes, here you can see that ophthalmic nerve of first branch of trigeminal nerve, it supplies skin of upper face, yes, so it is superior eyelid and forehead and also dorsal part of the nose, yes. Then maxillary nerve supplies skin of the middle face, the cheeks, yes, and also wings of the nose and upper lip, yes. And mandibular nerve supplies lower face and also region in front of the auricle. And here we have already studied it, region of the neck and also behind the auricle, inferior part of the auricle, and these things like regions which are located behind the auricle, they are supplied by cervical plexus. You remember it, yes? There is transverse cervical nerve, there is great auricular nerve, less occipital, and so on. Yes, we studied it in peripheral nervous system. Motor fibers of trigeminal nerve are present only in its third branch, that is mandibular nerve. Maxillary nerve and ophthalmic nerve, they are purely sensory. So mandibular nerve also contains sensory fibers. It carries only general touch, position, so proprioceptive, yes, and pain temperature, sensory sensation from the mouth. It doesn't carry taste sensation. Please pay your attention at it. So because taste nucleus that is responsible for the gustatory function, yes, it is solitary tract nucleus. Solitary tract nucleus does not belong to nucleus of trigeminal nerve. So trigeminal nerve is responsible only for general sensation. Taste is a special sense, yes, and it has a special nucleus. So taste fibers from anterior 2/3 of the tongue are initially carried in the lingual nerve, that is anatomically a branch of the mandibular nerve. But then these fibers, they enter chorda tympani, that is a branch of the seventh cranial nerve. And via the chorda tympani, it reaches finally solitary tract nucleus. Please memorize it. And taste fibers from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue and the pharynx are carried by branches of cranial nerves 7th, 9th, and 10th. So here you can see it. Yes, lingual nerve, it is actually a terminal branch of the mandibular nerve. And from the lingual papilla, fibers start, and first they pass here in the lingual nerve, but after that they separate from it, and they form chorda tympani nerve that forms synapse. These fibers form synapse in the geniculate ganglion, and after that they reach solitary tract nucleus. Here you can see it. And so motor nuclei of motor fibers of mandibular nerve, as we have already said, supply masticatory muscles and also some of the suprahyoid muscles, such as mylohyoid and geniohyoid, and also anterior belly of digastric muscle. So seventh pair of cranial nerves, it is facial nerve, nervus facialis. It is a mixed nerve with autonomic fibers, and primarily it controls muscles of facial expression, carries special visceral sensory taste information from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and hard and soft palate, and parasympathetic efference to the salivary glands in the oral cavity. So it contains sensory, motor, as well as autonomic fibers. Yes, seventh pair. And functionally, it can be divided into two parts. There is proper facial nerve that is formed by purely motor fibers, and intermediate nerve or nerve of Risbeck that contains taste, sensory, and parasympathetic fibers. It's like functionally, but anatomically, they start with a single trunk. That's why we consider it as a single facial nerve. But here in this diagram, if you see something, you can see that motor fibers, they mainly form branches after the exit from the facial canal. And this sensory, taste, sensory, and parasympathetic fibers, they arise from the nerve inside the facial canal. So there are, in different books, the different information is given. From 3 to 4 nuclei are distinguished in the facial nerve. But motor is 1, and sensory is also 1. And regarding the number of parasympathetic nuclei, somewhere it's written that it's also 1, and somewhere it's written that they are 2. So motor nucleus of facial nerve is located among the neurons of reticular formation of the pons, and it is projected onto the rhomboid fossa laterally to the facial colliculus, and its axons form this facial colliculus itself. Yes. Sensory nucleus is solitary tract nucleus. It is located in medulla oblongata, and it contains bodies of neurons which provide taste sensitivity. It is projected onto rhomboid fossa laterally from sulcus limitans. And 2 parasympathetic nuclei, superior salivatory and lacrimal. They both are situated in reticular formation of pons dorsally from motor nucleus from facial nerve. So here you can see it is motor nucleus of facial nerve. Here we can see solitary tract nucleus. You see it's long because it belongs to 3 nerves, yes, 7th, 9th, and 8th pairs. And there are 2 more. Here lacrimal nucleus is not demonstrated, but here we can see superior salivatory nucleus. Regarding the lacrimal nucleus, yes, in some books it is distinguished, in some books it is not. Actually, these bodies of neurons of superior salivatory and lacrimal nucleus, they are located very close to each other. But because function is definitely different, so lacrimal nucleus is responsible for lacrimation. What does it mean? This means production of tears by lacrimal gland, yes? And the superior salivatory nucleus is responsible for salivation, production of saliva by salivary glands, submandibular, sublingual, yes? So that's why in some books, yes, they are divided. So root of facial nerve, as well as root of abducer nerve, leaves the brain in the pontomedullary junction. Laterally from the place of origin of abducer nerve, and medially from the place of origin of vestibulocochlear nerve. And after that, it leaves a cranial cavity through internal acoustic meters. And when we studied craniology, you also remember we studied it, yes, that facial canal forms two curves, yes, two bands. First, it goes perpendicularly to longitudinal axis of petrous part of temporal bone. Then when it reaches level of the hiatus for greater petrosal nerve, it forms its first band, 90 degrees, and it continues moving backward, parallel to the longitudinal axis of the petrous part of temporal bone. At the level of posterior wall of tympanic cavity, it forms its second band, and it goes after that vertically downward until it reaches stylomastoid foramen. So stylomastoid foramen, it is the end of the facial canal. It is a foramen through which facial nerve leaves cranial cavity. And so, yes, sensory fibers, they pass in the chorda tympani to reach the tongue, yes, and motor fibers, after living through stylomastoid foramen, they are divided into a big goose foot. Here we can see it. Big goose foot that is formed by 5 branches. It is temporal branch, zygomatic branch, buccal branch, mandibular branch, and descending cervical branch. So all of these 5 branches, they supply muscles of facial expression. These are motor fibers, yes? And so parasympathetic fibers, they pass through both chorda tympani as well as greater petrosal nerve that arises from the facial nerve inside the facial canal, and then it joins sympathetic nerve, that is deep petrosal nerve. They form together nerve of pterygoid canal that through the pterygoid canal reaches pterygopalatine fossa, and after that, like it forms synapse with pterygopalatine ganglion and some other structures, and finally it supplies lacrimal gland and submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. So the eighth pair of cranial nerves, it is vestibulocochlear nerve, nervus vestibulocochlearis. It is purely sensory nerve, yes, of hearing and equilibrium, and it consists of 2 parts, a vestibular nerve and cochlear nerve. Also, we discussed it when we studied organ of hearing and organ of balance. Vestibular nerve starts from vestibule, from macula of utricle and saccule, yes, and also from ampular crests of semicircular canals. And cochlear nerve starts from organ of Corti, yes, and after that they join together. They enter cranial cavity through internal acoustic meters. Also, vestibular and cochlear nerves, they have different ganglia. Vestibular ganglion for vestibular nerve and the spiral ganglion for cochlear nerve, and the roots leave the brain through at the level of pontomedullary junction. Yes, okay, but before we'll say it, we'll have to talk about the nuclei, yes? So in vestibulocochlear nerve, there are 6 nuclei. 2 of them are cochlear nuclei and 4 are vestibular nuclei. All the nuclei are located in lateral part of pons and projected onto the rhomboid fossa at its vestibular areas. So cochlear nuclei, they are ventral and dorsal, and vestibular nuclei are superior, inferior, lateral, and medial. So if we start from the superior and we'll start moving around the circle, Then it will be Bechterew, Deiter's nucleus, Roller's nucleus, and Schwalbe nucleus. Here are their names, because each of these nuclei was discovered by different scientists, and each scientist decided to give his name to this nucleus to stay in the memory of people, yes, to stay in history. So here you can see vestibular areas. They are located in the boundary between pons and medulla oblongata, yes, laterally. And yes, as I have already told you, roots of vestibulocochlear nerve leave the brain in the most lateral part of pontomedullary junction. In some books, it's also written cerebellopontine angle. So yes, these are the roots. And after that, they also leave cranial cavity through internal acoustic meatus, but not like facial nerves. They do not enter facial canal, but they reach, as I have already told you, internal ear, yes, inner ear, cochlea, correspondingly cochlear nerve reaches the cochlea, and vestibular nerve reaches vestibule and semicircular canals, and that's it. Actually, we are not quite correct when we say that sensory nerves leave cranial cavity. Yes, it's actually wrong. We have to say that sensory nerves enter cranial cavity, and their roots also enter the brain. That will be more correct to say. Okay, the ninth pair of cranial nerves, it is glossopharyngeal nerve, nervus glossopharyngeus. It is a mixed nerve with autonomic fibers. So it provides sensory and motor supply of structures of tongue and pharynx. So glossa, if you remember, in Greek it is tongue, pharynx it is pharynx, so it supplies tongue and pharynx, obviously, yes. So it is mixed nerve with autonomic fibers. There are 3 nuclei, 1 motor, 1 sensory, and 1 parasympathetic. Specifically, the functions of the 9th pair of cranial nerves, glossopharyngeal nerve, include the following. It receives general sensory fibers from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, tonsils, soft palate, pharynx, and the middle ear through the tympanic nerve and eustachian tube. It also receives special sensory fibers mediating taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue and oral pharynx. And it supplies parasympathetic fibers to the parotid gland, which is the largest of the salivary glands found in the subcutaneous tissue of the face, which empties its secretion within the oral cavity. Certainly you remember this. There was no need to remind you, sorry. So it supplies motor fibers to stylopharyngeal muscle and upper pharyngeal muscles. And the action of these muscles is to facilitate swallowing by elevating larynx and pharynx. Look, if you think a little bit, you will see that there are actually some contradictions, yes? Because we will see it later that a sensory nucleus of the glossopharyngeal nerve, it is solitary tract nucleus. And we have already said that it is taste. And yes, in some books it's written, and I think it is correct, that also glossopharyngeal nerve receives fibers from spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. Yes, so there are some anastomosis. Because if this anastomosis is absent, then how can glossopharyngeal nerve carry these general sensory fibers? Certainly it is impossible, yes? Okay, so nuclei of glossopharyngeal nerve are the following. So first, motor nucleus is nucleus ambiguus. It is located in medulla oblongata, and it is projected onto the rhomboid fossa at the caudal fovea. So ambiguous, you remember, it's like double nucleus, yes, and it belongs at the same time to glossopharyngeal and to the vagus nerve. And sensory nucleus, it is solitary tract nucleus. It is located in medulla oblongata, contains bodies of neurons which provide taste sensitivity, and it is projected onto rhomboid fossa laterally from sulcus climitans. And parasympathetic nucleus is an inferior salivatory nucleus. It is situated in the reticular formation of medulla oblongata between inferior salivary nucleus and nucleus ambiguus. So that's the solitary tract, we have already seen it. Yes, nucleus ambiguous is here. This yellow one, actually it's wrong. Yes, it must be red. Or usually motor nuclei, they are marked with a red color. Yes, and here we can see inferior salivatory nucleus. It is somewhat blue, but it must be green. Yes. So this is inferior salivatory nucleus. Okay, the root of the glossopharyngeal nerve leaves the brain in the retroolivary sulcus or posterolateral sulcus of medulla oblongata, in the uppermost part of it. Yes, and then after that, it leaves cranial cavity through jugular foramen, And after that, yes, we have already said, it supplies the tongue, it supplies pharynx, it also gives a branch to the carotid sinus, and so on. Okay. So 10th pair of cranial nerves, it is vagus nerve, nervus vagus. It is a mixed nerve with autonomic fibers. And if to translate vagus from the Latin, it's actually, we can say it's lost nerve, the nerve that was lost. Why is it named like that? Because it is the longest cranial nerve. And it does not only supply organs of head and neck and muscles, like anything in head and neck, as we used to think that it is correct for the cranial nerves, but vagus nerve goes downward. It passes through the thoracic cavity, supplies thoracic cavity organs, goes downward, pieces the diaphragm, supplies abdominal cavity organs, and it supplies, for example, if we are talking about the digestive tract, it supplies large intestine up to the distal 1/3 of transverse colon. So that's why Asian scientists decided that it is like lost nerve, vagus nerve. It forgot that it is cranial nerve and it shouldn't supply all of these structures. Yes. So it participates in formation and swallowing, and it also supplies cardiac and smooth muscles of esophagus, stomach, and intestines up to the level of descending colon. So not absolutely up to the descending, I told you, it is up to the boundary between middle and distal 1/3 of the transverse colon. That is vagus nerve. So specifically functions of the 10th pair of cranial nerves include general sensory information. It is from the external ear, parts of the external surface of the tympanic membrane, and pharynx, larynx, esophagus, trachea, heart, abdominal and thoracic viscera. Motor fibers from voluntary muscles of the pharynx and most of the larynx, and soft palate muscles such as palata glossus and levator palatini muscle. Tensor veli palatini, you remember, it is supplied by the trigeminal nerve. Yes. Yes, it's written, by the way, here. Yes. Parasympathetic supply of smooth muscle and glands of mentioned above structures, and also efferent and efferent projections of the vagus nerve, along with the glossopharyngeal nerve, form reticular neural circuits of reflexes, such as gagging, coughing, vomiting, sneezing, and swallowing. Yes, so they are responsible for this unconditional reflexes. So vagus nerve, as it is mixed with parasympathetic fibers, so it contains 3 nuclei. Motor nucleus is nucleus ambiguous again. I will not repeat, yes. Sensory nucleus is solitary tract nucleus, and also I will not repeat location and projection onto the rhomboid fossa. And parasympathetic nucleus, it is a dorsal nucleus of vagus nerve. It is situated dorsally in medulla oblongata, and it is projected as a triangle of vagus nerve. Here we can see it. Yes, dorsal nucleus of the vagus nerve. Okay, that is certainly laterally from the hypoglossal trigone, if you remember. Okay, so the root of vagus nerve leaves the brain through the retroolivary sulcus, and after that it leaves cranial cavity again through jugular foramen. Through jugular foramen, when we studied vessels, we were saying that through the jugular foramen, internal jugular vein passes, but it is big, and through this foramen also 3 pairs of cranial nerves leave cranial cavity. They are glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve, and also accessory nerve. And branches of vagus nerve, we'll discuss them as the practical classes because there are many. There are several parts in vagus nerve, so I think we'll discuss it as the practical classes. So 11th pair, it is accessory nerve, nervus accessorius. It is named accessory, like additional, yes, we can say, because it is very small nerve. It supplies only two muscles, we can say. So it is motor nerve, it controls head movement, and it supplies sternocleidomastoid muscle and trapezius muscle on the ipsilateral side. So here we can see nucleus of accessory nerve. It's long. It also starts from the medulla oblongata, and then it continues downward in the spinal cord up to the level of 5th or 6th cervical segment of spinal cord. There are two roots in accessory nerve, cranial root and spinal root. Cranial root leaves the brain through retroolivary sulcus, and spinal root leaves spinal cord through leaves cranial cavity, leaves the brain in the posterior lateral sulcus of spinal cord, yes? And after that, they join together, they leave cranial cavity through the jugular foramen, and after that, accessory nerve is divided into two branches. One branch supplies muscles, which we mentioned above, yes, and the other branch, it joins vagus nerve. Vagus nerve. And so the 12th pair of cranial nerves, it is hypoglossal nerve, nervus hypoglossus. It is motor nerve. It supplies all the intrinsic muscles of the tongue and 3 of the 4 major extrinsic muscles, except the palatoglossus that is supplied by vagus nerve, yes. So also it forms ansa cervicalis. Branches of ansa cervicalis, we have already said that inferior root of ansa cervicalis are formed by branches of cervical plexus, yes, and here superior root is formed by hypoglossal nerve. So branches of ansa cervicalis supply all the intrahyoid muscles and also geniohyoid muscle. So nucleus of hypoglossal nerve is projected onto the hypoglossal trigone. It is motor, and it is located in the medulla oblongata, yes? And roots of hypoglossal nerve leave the brain through the anterolateral sulcus, and cranial nerve leaves through special hypoglossal canal that is located in the base of the occipital condyles. So that is very briefly, very short information about cranial nerves that I hope will help you in studying cranial nerves. Thank you for your attention. Do you have any questions? I thought so. There is no one who stayed with me till the end. Goodbye.